Subscribe. 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 No. Subscribe. Subscribe. Submarine subscription. Subscribe. 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 Sub 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 sub. Subscribe. 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 Sub 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 subscribe. Scribe sub. Scribe sub. Subscribe. 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 Sarsaparilla. Subscribe. 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 S-U-S. Is us? No. S-U-B-S. Cribe. Subscribe. I forgot how to spell subscribe. Spell subscribe in the comments. Subscribe. Subscribe. I wonder how many times the subscribe button glows every time I say subscribe. 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 Have you subscribed yet? Subscribe. 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 Submarine subscription. Subscribe. There's a scribe in this sub. Subscribe. 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 Subscripciones. Abonnieren Sie bitte. Subscribe. 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 Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 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 Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subby, subscribe, subby, bubby, subscribe, 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 Subscribe. 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 5 minutes of subscribe. 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 I only have to do this 10 times more now to make an hour of subscribe. 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 Bye. Subscribe. Subscribe. This is an hour of me saying subscribe, and none of it is repeated. Subscribe. I wonder how many subscriptions will happen from the subscriptiones. Subscribe. I hope people unsubscribe from my subscribe video. Subscribe. It's really hard to say subscribe multiple times because then you start saying scubscribe and it sounds wrong because it's not a word, and subscribe is a word. Scubscribe is not a word. Subscribe is a word. Scubscribe is not a word. Subscribe is a word. Sandwiches. I'm hungry for subscriptions. I'm hungry for subscribe. Subscribe, hit that subscribe button and do things to the bell. I don't care what you do to it. Just do things to it. But you have to hit the subscribe button. Subscribe. I am taking subscriptions to a whole new subscribe. Subscribe. 7.5 minutes of subscriptions. Subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe? No, that's not a word at all. Das ist kein Wort. Subscription. Subscribe. 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 How many Mississippis have I said subscribe? Tell me in the comments. Tell me how much you hate my voice. Tell me how much you do not want to subscribe. Don't 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 subscribe. Do not subscribe to my subscription. Don't subscribe. Subscribe. I have actually said all of these subscribes. This is not AI. I am a real human. Me asks subscribe. You subscribe. Subscribe. I am wasting your life right now. Subscribe. You are wasting time listening to me saying subscribe. I am so committed to subscription to subscribe that I am saying this for 10 minutes straight now. I have not let up. My voice hurts from saying subscribe, 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 subscribe. The German word for subscribe is abonnieren. Subscribe, 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 abonnier, abonnier, abonnier. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. The German word is easier to say over and 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 over. Abonnier, 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 abonnieren Sie. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Wow, wacky, crazy, subscribe, 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 subscribe. 11 minutes of subscribe, 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 subscribe. I am so subscribed right now. Are you subscribed? Don't subscribe to me. Unsub. Report this subscription. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Some YouTubers told me to do this, so now I'm saying subscribe. Is it working yet? Have you unsubscribed from my subscription? Are you subscribed to my unsubscription? Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I have a cold. I had a cold, and that's why I'm nasally. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe is not a word. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, 12 and a half minutes of subscribe, 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 subscribe. Disk space remaining for recording 110 hours and 58 minutes of subscribe. That's not how long I'm going to record this. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. It's only going to be an hour of subscribe. If I am over, then you can unsubscribe from my subscription. And if I am under, then you can subscribe from my unsubscription. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Write in the comments below what subscribe is in your native language. If it's not English. If it is English, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. What is the British word for subscription? Subscribe, 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 subscribe. There is no cuts in this. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I'm chewing on a subscribe button. The subscribe button. I am chewing on a subscribe button. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I ate the subscribe button. You know, it's crunchy. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe. Almost 15 minutes of subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 shit post, 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 subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Do the chicken dance while you say subscribe, 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 subscribe. Bok, bok, bok. Subscribe. 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 Subscribe is dinosaur for I love you. Subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. 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 Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 17 and 15 seconds. 17 minutes and 17 seconds. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Yeah. Subscribe, 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 you subscribe to the sub spot. You know, like there's that special spot on a lady, and you touch it, and she goes subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 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 Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Launch all subscriptions. All your subscription are belong to subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 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 Subscribe, 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 Subscribe. Subscribe. 20 minutes of subscriptions. Subscribe. 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 I'm holding my tongue while I say subscribe. 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 Has all lost meaning. Lost all meaning. Subscribe. 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 My voice is still going. That's kind of crazy. Subscribe. I would have thought that subscribe would have damaged my vocal cords, but it didn't. Vocal cords. Subscribe. 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 Marine. Subscribe. 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 Subscribe sandwiches. Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Over the subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 ship, post, subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. I am taking YouTube poops to a new level. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Although someone in the comments will say you pointed it out, so you're not. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Women cannot subscribe. Men cannot subscribe. Children don't exist. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. 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 Only non-binary people are allowed to subscribe. 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 Everyone in the audience, yell subscribe. 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 Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 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 Subscribe is a Zen cone. If you say it enough, you will transcend into the subscription zone. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subs. I tried to force a burp, but it came out as subscribe, 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 subscribe Subscribe. Pop that subscription cherry. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. That wasn't funny. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. 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 Subscribe.
Subscribe.
Subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe.
Subscribe. Subscribe. This is how you would say it if you were a dentist. Subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe.
Subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. What if they come at me with a subscription stick? Subscribe, a pointed stick on a subscription. Subscribe. This is not the subscriptions you are looking for. Subscribe. Pop culture reference. Subscribe. Your subscribers thought about whether you could subscribe or not, but they never asked if you should subscribe. Subscribe. If you listened thus far, you will get a subscription. Subscribe. Subscribe. This is how fishies say subscribe. Subscribe. Oh, by the way, when I was doing the fishy thing, I was like pushing my cheeks in. Like, you can't see it because I'm not recording video, but I said subscribe with my cheeks pushed in and my lips pushed out like a little fishy. It sounds funny, doesn't it? Subscribe. I'm afraid of subscriptions. I am subscription phobe. I'm subscribe phobic. Subscribe. Subscribing is woke. Subscribing is fascist. Do not do either of these things. Do not subscribe and do not subscribe. These are two different. Subscribe and subscribe are two different things. And if you can't see it, people, you're not subscribed. Subscribe. Subscribe. Go home, Auntie M. You're drunk. You're talking about subscriptions for 29 whole minutes. What the subscribe is wrong with you? What is subscribe? Subscribe. I saw a video that told me that saying subscribe is a good idea, so that's what I'm doing. I'm saying subscribe. Look what they did to my subscription box. Subscribe. Subscribe. I'm in your house right now telling you to subscribe. I am behind you. Look, don't look behind you. Look behind you. Subscribe. Don't subscribe. Do subscribe. Don't subscribe. Do subscribe. Don't subscribe. Do subscribe. Subscribe. Schrodinger's subscription. I put a subscriber in a box with a little bit of radiation It was funny. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. 30 minutes of subscribe. 30 minutes of subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Halfway there. Subscribe, halfway there. Subscribe, halfway there. Subscribe, halfway there. Just remember, if I go over or under the 60 minutes exactly, subscribe. Then subscribe, 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 and hit that bell button. The bell button jeans. Bell button jeans with the subscription. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. So, fun fact, there are 206 subscriptions in your body. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. The subscription is the powerhouse of the YouTube channel. Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 tuna, subscribe, tuna, subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe has lost all meaning to me. Subscribe, I have been saying subscribe for 32 and a half minutes almost. It's actually not quite. I was a little early on saying the 32 and a half minutes, and now it is right now. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I don't like my voice. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. I don't like public talkings. I don't like speaking in front of other people. I don't like it when people hear my voice. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I don't like it when people subscribe. I love it when people subscribe. Do not subscribe to me unless you are subscribed. Then don't. Then do. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. Put some subscriptions in your butthole and keep it there for safekeeping. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. We got to take our subscriptions to Mordor, Frodo. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscription. Subscribe, 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 sub 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 sub. Subscribe, 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 BDI, subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe if you are a vampire. Subscribe if you are not a vampire. Subscribe if you are already subscribed. Subscribe if you are not subscribed. Subscribe, 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 Subscribe. Don't share this video. Subscribe. Is it a video if it's audio only with a picture over it that says subscribe? Subscribe. I have written a video essay. I'm a video essayist now because it's an hour long. Any video on YouTube that's like an hour and all I've been saying is basically just subscribe, I'm a video essayist. I'm like the ContraPoints. I'm gonna name drop all of my favorite YouTubers. Me. Not me. Subscribe. Actually, Talbart's pretty cool. Subscribe. You should subscribe to Talbart. Like, seriously. Like, I'm not actually kidding. Like, I'm dead serious right now. Subscribe to Talbart. Unsubscribe for me and subscribe to Talbart. Subscribe. Block me from your recommends. Subscribe. I wonder how many people are going to get this far. Subscribe if you got this far. Subscribe if you didn't get this far. Timestamp the last point you heard. Subscribe. Subscribe if your channel is as old as mine. Subscribe if your channel is younger than mine. Subscribe if you are older than my channel. Subscribe. By the way, check out how old my channel is and then feel sad that I've been here this long. Subscribe. Fun fact, it's no longer on my channel, but my first video was me playing around with fire set to Fuel by Metallica. And that's not a joke. I'm actually serious about that. I was like 16. Subscribe. It got not demonetized. It got fucking nuked into oblivion. Subscribe. Go figure. Metallica likes their giant golden TVs. Metallica sucks. This is now a Metallica sucks video. Subscribe. I could make shit up right now and you wouldn't even know it. Subscribe. My channel is older than some people are allowed to vote. Subscribe. 2 more years, my channel can drink. Subscribe. Are you ready, kids, to subscribe? Subscribe. I can go on a tangent about subscriptions, and you'll love it. Or hate it. You'll probably hate it. This video is probably not going to do well, but I don't care. Hey, my aquarium turned on. Aquarium subscribe. Is your subscription running? You better go check it. Subscribe. When I was a teenager, we had a landline in my basement, and we were close enough to a radio radio station. It was a pirate radio station, and it would blast on like any available channel that it could, legally and illegally, East Indian music. And it would be, you could pick it up on a landline, and to such a degree that the person on the other side of the phone call could also hear it. It was nuts. And you know what they were saying? Subscribe, 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 subscribe. But I think in like Hindu, they were saying subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. I don't know that word, by the way. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Ich spreche nur Deutsch. Subscribe, subscribe. Ich kann kein Englisch. This is just an illusion. You hearing me in English is the universal translator in your butthole saying subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. 40 minutes and 20 seconds. Subscribe it. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. When I was a little girl, my mother told me to subscribe, and then she exploded in a fiery flame of subscriptions. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I wasn't actually a little girl. I was born a giant, and I've been getting smaller with each subscription I get. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I lied a little while ago when I said this wasn't AI. This is all AI, every second of it. None of this is a real person. AI, AI, AI. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 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 Subscribe, 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 subscribe. All of human history led to this moment of me saying subscribe for an hour. Does that make you feel great? Because it makes me feel great. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Our ancestors subscribed to mastodon meat. Subscribe. 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 Neanderthals subscribed to extinction as a joke. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe if you hate me. Don't subscribe if you love me. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. 42 minutes of subscribe. There once was a whale and a potted petunia. And when they woke up, they found themselves falling from a great height. And the whale started pondering about life and existence and the big flat thing that was coming towards it. And the potted petunia said, subscribe, 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 subscribe. 2 girls, 1 subscription. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribing is historically accurate. Not subscribing is also historically accurate. Subscribe, subscribe. The etymology of subscribe comes from the fact that medieval monks used to live in submarines. Insert subscription here. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe to NordVPN. Actually, don't. Subscribe to me. And only me. Unsub from every channel you have in your subscription and subscribe to only me. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. The French invented subscriptions. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. George Washing Machine said that he could not subscribe to a lie. Babe Lincoln subscribed to emancipation subscriptions. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. James Cameron once in an interview said that he had a fever and it gave him weird dreams. And when he woke up, He made a movie called Subscribe, 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 Subscribe. 15 more minutes of subscribe, 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 subscribe. I gotta sneeze, and I'm trying not to sneeze, because then it would ruin my subscribe script. This is all scripted, by the way. None of this is off the top of my head. Right now, I am reading words that tell me to say subscribe, subscribe. There's a teleprompter right in front of my face. Subscribe. I lied about that part. It was actually a guy with a gun-shaped object telling me to say subscribe for an hour or he won't subscribe to my channel. Subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Later today, I actually have to work on a video game that I'm making. Subscribe. I'm wasting time saying subscribe. I should be feeding my fish right now. The light turned on, and they are a little antsy. They want their little bloodworms. I got neon tetras. They're all subscribed to living in my subscription box. Subscribe. Subscribe. Richard Nixon once said, "I am not a subscription." Subscribe. I did not have subscriptions with that lady. Subscribe. Grab them by the subscriptions. Subscribe. Subscribe if you're an anarchist. Subscribe if you are not an anarchist. Subscribe if you can speak English. Subscribe if you can't speak English. This would be a very confusing video if you couldn't subscribe in English. Subscribe. 1 subscription, 2 subscription, 3 subscription, 4 subscription, 5 subscription, 6 subscription, 7 subscription, 8 subscription, 9 miscription? Oh, I tried to say Mississippi and I failed. Subscribe. Subscribe. 48 minutes of subscribe. Will this add to my subscriptions? I genuinely unsubscribe. Genuinely. Stop watching my subscriptions and videos. Subscribe. Disk space remaining for subscription. 110 subscriptions and 21 subscriptions. Subscribe. 11 more minutes of subscribe. Subscribe. How much does the subscribe cost? That is a meme only Germans will know. Subscribe. Warum kann ich Deutsch sprechen? Ich weiß es nicht, aber abonnieren Sie, wenn Sie die Antwort wissen. Subscribe. I will actually not answer why I can speak German, by the way. Just so you know. Subscribe. subscribe, 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 subscribe. The answer is I have subscribed to myself. Bet you didn't know you could do that, but you can. You could use your own channel to subscribe to your own channel. Give it a try. Make a channel. Subscribe to it. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. I'm getting lightheaded. Subscribe. Help. Subscribe. I can't breathe. Subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 ASMR style subscribe, 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 subscribe. Gen Z brain rot. Subscribe. 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 I am 35 subscriptions old. Subscribe. 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 I created this channel so I could subscribe to porn channels on YouTube. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I am from the subscription days of subscribing to porn channels on subscription. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I actually didn't do that. Or did I? Or didn't I? I subscribed to corn channels. Subscribe. Subscribe. There is big subscription under your seat right now. Everyone gets a subscription. You get a subscription. You get a subscribe. And you get a subscribe. Except for they're all not tax exempt. So you're going to get fucked over by... You can't afford the subscription because you're poor and you watch Oprah. Subscribe. 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 Another forced burp that didn't come out right. Subscribe. Subscribe to me to make fun of me. Bully me. Subscribe. 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 Call me and subscribe. 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 I know this is crazy, but subscribe maybe. Subscribe. A subscription I used to know. Subscribe. 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 He's mostly subscribed. Not fully subscribed. There's a difference. Subscribe. 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 A subscription. A subscription. Subscribe. 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 Ew. That's the subscribe alarm. Subscribe, 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 subscribed, not stirred. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I ain't got time to subscribe. Subscribe. And god dang sexual tyranna subscribe. 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 Abonnieren. Subscribe. 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 In the last 5 minutes of subscribe. 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 Subscribe, 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 subscribe. One long, arduous take of subscriptions. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. If this video gets 100 likes and achieves me 2 subscriptions, I'll post to an OnlyFans of a 2-hour-long video of me saying subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. You thought I was going to say something dirty. Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. If I get 4 subscribers from this video, I will reveal my face. Don't look at any of my previous videos. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. If you followed me, if you subscribed to me at any point, because I made a funny haha video about Star Trek or, like, I don't know, a YouTube poop. Joke's on you. I make whatever I want, including subscribe for an hour. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. 57 minutes and 24 seconds of subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. My wife took my subscribe, and my dog took my subscribe, and now I'm a country subscribe. Yeah! Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 58 minutes. 2 more minutes left of subscribe. When I started, 2 minutes felt like forever. And that was like 58 forevers ago. That math doesn't subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I want to subscribe. You want to subscribe. Let's subscribe together. Yeah. Subscribe. 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 Somewhere over the subscription rainbow. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. It's actually getting easier for me to not say subscribe anymore. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. 1 more minute left of subscribe, 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 subscribe. I wonder how long this video will take to render and then upload. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 40 seconds left. Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 15 seconds left. subscribe, 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 subscribe.